I will approach the topic from a quite different angle, from the philosophy of mind. And so I'm very interested in psychological conditions of we perspectives. So that's the title of my talk, what we perspectives are grounded in. Now, the overall topic of my talk is the question of how we should actually understand everyday collective attitudes. For example, the intention to go for a walk together or together for a political demonstration. The main focus so far, especially in philosophical debates, are full-fledged or explicit collective attitudes, as typically expressed in sentences like, "We will go for a walk later on." So accordingly, authors so far have mainly concentrated on an analysis of, for example, the content, the mode, or the subject of collective intentional states or collective attitudes. Now, what's still neglected is an exploration of the underpinnings of everyday collective attitudes, especially an investigation of experiential and social cognitive underpinnings of collective perspectives or of we perspectives. So this is what I will concentrate on in my talk. The thesis I will argue for is the following: explicit collective attitude, explicit collective intentional states are grounded in relevant precursors and background phenomena. So, and those precursors are functionally related to explicit collective attitudes, such that they are relevant to an adequate understanding of full-fledged collective attitudes. And to this end, I will turn to the pre-intentional or the experiential level, more specifically to the level of nonverbal behavior and social micro-interactions. So my thoughts will be based on the underlying assumption that collective attitudes and collective intentional states come in different levels and different degrees. So there's an experiential level, a pre-intentional level, intentional level, and probably some more. So the outline of my talk is the following. I will start with some preliminary clarifications. I will then give an argument on the theoretical relevance to kind of analyze experiential processes in order to motivate my thoughts. Oops, sorry. And I will then outline something which I call a minimal sense of us, and afterwards I will turn to some disturbances of this minimal sense of us. Okay, I will start with preliminary clarifications. First, I would like to specify the target phenomenon a bit more. As I said in my introduction, I'm interested in precursors of everyday collective attitudes expressed in sentences as follows. For example, we intend to go protest on the street. We will go to a meeting. We agree upon P, say, a political issue. Here are some constraints to the target phenomenon. I shall only refer to informal and small and non-organized groups. A further constraint is that the persons in question, so two or more persons forming a collective perspective, have to be present at a certain time at a certain place. Now, what do I mean by the expression precursor of Y, referring to an explicit collective intentional state? Here are some possible meanings. Precursor may be understood in a phylogenetic way. Then the expression refers to evolutionary developmental stages. This is something, for example, Michael Tomasello is interested in. The expression precursor may also be understood in an ontogenetic way. Then it would refer to individual developmental stages John Michael and Schelecki, for example, are taking that perspective on the issue. However, the term might also be taken as a mental antecedent of a given collective attitude, and this is the sense I am interested in the following. So I say a bit more about this meaning. Okay, X as a mental antecedent of Y, Y referring to a collective attitude to phi at a certain point in time. Well, the first thing to remark is that X and Y are to be taken as differently structured mental states. Y is to be understood as a thought, an intentional state directed to an object which has a semantically evaluable content, and it is typically conscious. X, on the other hand, is to be understood as an experiential state. It is pre-intentional, as I call it, and it is typically not in the focus of attention. It might be peripherally conscious, and it may become more salient given to a certain, given a certain situation. And it is often automatically activated. Now, it's a type of mental state which makes it normally difficult for agents to kind of clearly identify it and to report about it. The relation that obtains between X and Y may be provisionally characterized as X supporting or X sustaining Y. I'm aware that this expression is quite vague, but I will try to further specify what I mean by that in the following. So, and furthermore, the expression mental antecedent allows for a genetic description such Y emerges from X. I will now turn to the theoretical relevance of taking experiential precursors of a given collective intentional attitude into account. Why should we actually bother to take a closer look at them? And to demonstrate the theoretical relevance, I will very briefly refer to Margaret Gilbert's account, and I will take her account just as an example. It may be transferred in a slightly different way to other accounts which focus very much on explicit collective attitudes. Now, Gilbert famously argues that attitudes are collective when they are held by a plural subject. She argues that plural subjects consists of individual subjects being specifically related to each other. According to Gilbert, plural subjects have to be created or brought about by an act of joint commitment to do something together. Here's a quote: "The parties jointly commit to phi as a body, that is, individual subjects thereby express their willingness to jointly attain a certain goal." Now, the problem which is connected to this description and which already have been raised by several, I think, Reimer, you also had some difficulties with that description suggested by Gilbert, expressing the willingness to jointly commit to do something together already seems to presuppose some sort of collective attitude, some relatedness, say, in communicating with each other, in referring to each other with the help of the expression us and we. So if, according to Gilbert, joint commitment is responsible for collective intentionality, so if joint commitment already presupposes collective intentionality, then there seems to be a problem of circularity. However, Gilbert herself at some point writes that the readiness for a given joint commitment may emerge gradually over time. Unfortunately, she doesn't say anything further to this interesting issue, but it seems that a detailed account of what that precisely means may eventually be able to solve the problem above. So if we can identify some form of experiential collectivity or jointness, which is not already a collective intentional state, then I think we're in a better position to explain what makes collective attitudes collective. So therefore, I think we have good reasons to identify and describe experiential precursors of collective attitudes and explicit joint commitments. And this will be my task in the following. So I will claim that a relevant precursor is what I will call a minimal sense of us. So the question is, what does it mean to experience someone as a co-subject and potential partner for cooperation? No problem. So, okay, what does it actually mean to experience someone as a co-subject and potential partner for cooperation? And here are some requirements that I think an adequate description must meet. And of course, I will afterwards analyze the sense of us in more detail. So, as already mentioned in my preliminary remarks, I'm looking for a mental state which is experiential, pre-intentional, not in the focus of attention, but it may eventually become salient. In terms of content, the mental state has to represent some intersubjective relation, some form of coordination, and I think plausibly it has to comprise some motivational component. And moreover, I should mention that the content doesn't exist apart from, like, word-directed contents. Rather, it is part of a more complex content of a mental state. Okay, so I think those minimal requirements are intuitively plausible in order to make sense of a precursor of a collective attitude as something out of which collective attitudes may arise. So my aim now is to come up with an appropriate description of the sense of us, and as it is a pre-linguistic phenomenon, it must be both phenomenologically and empirically adequate. So the following analysis attempts to do justice to the previous requirements, and I will try to show that for a minimal sense of us, at least 3 conditions must be in place. And I will begin with a very broad condition, and the conditions I will kind of describe become more and more restrictive. I should also mention that there are sometimes no clear-cut borders between the conditions I will describe and analyze. So there may be some overlap between each of them. So here are the conditions. Basic intersubjectivity is the first condition. Micro-interaction is the second condition. And a feeling of binding is the third condition. So and now in the following, I will specify each one of these conditions. And so I will begin with the first one, basic intersubjectivity. Establishing a collective attitude with others depends very generally on a mutual awareness of others as sentient beings. So this mutual awareness doesn't require any conscious thought or any inferential reasoning. And I think that this is in line with our everyday experiences, because most of the time one is only, you know, kind of peripherally aware of other beings around oneself, For example, when you walk down the street, you see lots of different things. You see cars and trees and bicycles, but you also see pedestrians, and you don't really pay attention to them. However, you are still aware that they are there. This mutual awareness of others implies a distinction, at least an implicit distinction, between oneself, sentient beings, and other things which are not sentient beings. Now, that this distinction is in place is revealed by the fact that the behavior of sentient beings is normally less predictable to agents than the behavior of other things. Sentient beings typically show a more flexible and a less foreseeable behavior than other things. And according to findings from developmental psychology, which is really interesting, already very young infants are capable of that distinction, presumably. And this is probably why this distinction is so natural to us, and why it doesn't require any cognitive effort. Now, to have an awareness of other agents is often revealed in the readiness to interact with them, as opposed to, say, inanimate objects. Now, this first condition, as I already mentioned, is a very, very broad condition, this mutual awareness of others. It doesn't yet give us a sense of us in the sense described. This should be clear. So we're around other people most of the time without having a specific sense of jointness, for example, with others. Plausibly, however, this first condition, basic intersubjectivity, is the condition for the next condition, which is microinteraction. Having a sense of us depends furthermore on a more or less successful interaction with others. So for an exchange of appropriate information, there must be some sort of direct encounter. Relevant to my analysis are forms of nonverbal interaction based off an exchange of nonverbal cues, for example, via eye contact, facial expression, and bodily posture. Empirical findings in social psychology show that nonverbal social cues are often produced and decoded in an automatic way. So a fast information processing is taking place that we are usually not aware of. According to approaches in social neuroscience, nonverbal interaction makes it apparently easier for interaction with partners and to perceive their mental states of others, perceive their mental states, and to predict and to interpret their behavior. So nonverbal interaction has a supporting role in an epistemic way for social cognition. And this in turn makes it easier to develop a joint perspective or to agree upon goals, of course. What's interesting is that on the neural level, the reward system becomes active in nonverbal interaction, for example, in situations of eye contact. This is interesting because it shows that interaction, also the prospect of cooperation with others, is evaluated as positive. And this suggests that there's an implicit motivation to cooperate with others. Now, this type of, well, say, non-committal or loose interaction also very likely happens all the time in everyday life. For example, when you take the bus or when you sit in a cafe, you catch the gaze of strangers quite frequently, I would suppose, sitting there. And of course, this is not yet sufficient for a sense of us I'm looking for in the described sense. A further requirement is needed that explains a stronger relatedness, a feeling of binding or being attuned to another person. And it should be clear that mere eye contact doesn't provide this sort of relatedness. Now, how can we get a better grip on this? And I would like to mention two interesting phenomena taken from social psychology, evidence suggests that people have a tendency to unconsciously mimic others. They mimic their facial expression, their posture, bodily movements, for example, foot shaking behavior. And this induces rapport and liking between people. So it's a form of unconscious coordination and bodily synchronization that apparently enhances bonding between agents, and it supports and facilitates the formation of cooperative goals. A further way of nonverbal coordination can be achieved by means of gaze leading, for example, by drawing the attention of another person to, say, an object. And experiments revealed that gaze leading generates a sense of social agency. What's interesting again is that on the neural level, this comes along with a higher activation of the reward system, and this suggests an even greater motivation to cooperate with others. So the examples, in my view, show a stronger intersubjective binding on the nonverbal level, a feature I identified as required for a sense of us. And in order to make this account more plausible, I will now briefly address the question of possible disturbances of this sense of us. And what suggests itself here is to look at discussions on so-called implicit biases, for example, on implicit automatically activated stereotypes, which often lead to unintentional discrimination. Well, unintentional discrimination, of course, comes in many different guises, one of which is clearly that potential cooperative behavior between agents is just not taking place. So many findings show that implicit biases, implicit stereotypes towards members of outgroups often prevent persons from cooperations. And for this reason, it is interesting to see whether those implicit biases have an impact already on the experiential level, on nonverbal interaction, and thereby on the sense of us. Well, the first thing to remark here is that, of course, most humans automatically track group membership on the basis of minimal cues. So, for example, the shape of the body and the skin color. So we usually automatically categorize people as part of our own social group, the in-group, or of an out-group. So, of course, this is not a bad thing in itself. Actually, on the contrary, because automatic social categorization is very useful because it helps to navigate through everyday life situations and also, of course, to cope with new unforeseen situations easily, pragmatically. But the other side of the coin is that those shortcuts, as one might call them, may lead to exclusionary behavior. Now, if stereotypes, implicit stereotypes become active, it seems very likely that this has an impact on nonverbal interaction, nonverbal behavior, and the prospect of cooperating with each other. And this is what some findings indeed reveal. Well, one set of experiments showed an impact of biases on the eye contact behavior between test persons and those leading the experiments. In one experiment, they compared the duration of eye contact of white test persons being interviewed by a white interviewer and compared to the duration of eye contact of those white test persons being interviewed by a black interviewer. Of course, this took place in the United States, where those kinds of experiments are kind of very strong for a long time already. Now, interestingly, In the first case, where the test persons were interviewed by a white interviewer, they showed a longer duration of eye contact, whereas in the second case, where the white test persons were interviewed by a black interviewer, they showed higher rates of blinking. And this is quite important because higher rates of blinking are related to negative arousal, whereas a longer duration of eye contact is related to a greater attraction, intimacy, and respect. Now, further experiments were made with persons who explicitly claimed that they didn't have prejudices whatsoever towards obese people, so they said that they were totally free of prejudices. However, in an experimental setting, they unconsciously behaved prejudiced. For example, they smiled less frequently at the target person, and they put the chair in a greater distance to the target person. So the upshot of this is that implicit biases and stereotypes strongly interfere with non-verbal interaction. Moreover, it suggests that already on a very low level, they seem to block a sense of us and plausibly collective attitudes to arise or emerge. I should probably add that the sense of us might of course be disturbed by a number of other factors, for example by a specific context, the personality of an individual, or personal experiences somebody has made in the past. I have picked out implicit biases because there is really such an extensive research going on that topic at the moment. Okay, conclusion. What are the consequences of what I just have shown for philosophical discussions and maybe also for other disciplines such as the social and political sciences? The empirical findings I introduced to you, they support the three conditions I outlined: basic intersubjectivity, micro-interaction, and the feeling of binding. And the findings thereby support an analysis of a phenomenon which has been neglected so far. Furthermore, the analysis revealed a certain function related to the sense of us. It facilitates perceiving mental states of potential cooperative partners. So this makes it easier to agree upon goals, to develop an explicit collective attitudes, and to express it accordingly. Moreover, the sense of us implies a motivational component that is a mechanism which explains why agents actually strive to cooperate. I outlined some effects of implicit biases on features of the sense of us, especially on the micro-interaction part and the feeling of binding. And of course, this was intended to make the account on precursors of collective attitudes, precursors of a weaker perspective, more plausible. Thank you very much.